My name is Eddie Jacobs. I'm doing a PhD in the ethics of psychedelic therapy, but what I'll be discussing today has nothing to do with my PhD. It's just a little extra thing that I've been thinking about. I'm going to be presenting some thoughts on using African perspectives on ethics as a lens through which to look at research practices using Ibogaine. And that's going to involve, first of all, my outlining some reasons to think that this might be an idea worth pursuing. I'll flesh out quite what I mean by African approaches to ethics, and then once I've oriented you to that, I'll give you an overview of what that might mean for research practices. Firstly, why I think this is worthwhile. So there are two reasons I think it's worthwhile. The first is just off the basis of my own thinking about clinical applications of psychedelics, especially my research interviews with participants in trials. I'm getting the growing impression that we might need to do more than the canonical approaches to ethics to properly capture what it means to do well in this space. That's not so much saying we're massively failing patients. I'm meaning to properly understand what doing well for patients means. Maybe we need to think about things differently. The second motivation I have is kind of more in line with the discussions we've been having this afternoon, is thinking about it as potentially a means to do like real respectful engagement with the cultures that have been stewards to these medicines and the wisdom about their use. So it's not a dominant view, but I've had conversations with people who think we need to translate entirely all of the practices of indigenous use into clinical context. Otherwise, we're failing in some important way. And that's either couched in terms of outcomes, i.e. it would just be better for patients if we're more closely moving things across, or on the basis of some sentiment like we're engaging in a colonial practice if we're just going to pick out the drug and throw out the rest. On the first one of those, like I think that's an empirical issue that we can leave to testing. I'm not convinced. On the second, I'm more sympathetic towards the sentiment going here, but I think it might be a dead end, at least in the clinical context. When you think about the sort of ontological set and setting shift that would require, like I don't think you can very easily opt into a new metaphysics for the afternoon, but I think you might be able to align a moral worldview a bit more easily. If you've not been moved by either of those motivations, just so that I can keep people in the room and you don't go off to another talk, there are other reasons too. So possibly this is just good methodological practice in ethics. There are prominent methodologies of doing ethics in the West. I think of things like moral intuitionism or the reflective equilibrium of John Rawls that effectively say moral intuitions are really important for testing if a moral theory is any good. Like this is a straightforward argument that says if your moral theory can't explain why killing, stealing, and lying are wrong, you've got a rubbish moral theory, right? And given that moral intuitions, moral judgments, and perspectives are important, good methodological practice would be sampling these moral intuitions widely, i.e. not just the moral intuitions we find within the West. Secondly, it may be, if you're familiar, if you've done a bit of ethics, you know about utilitarianism, principlism, you know about the ethics of care, you know about Kant, and you're maybe drawn a little bit towards all of them, but also recognize they also have knockdown objections, each one of them. If you think like that, you would do well to listen to the feminist philosopher Susan Sherwin, who suggests thinking of these grand moral theories as different tools for different jobs, or as different lenses that can be used singly or in combination to kind of bring out ethically salient features across different contexts. And so if you're moved by that, hey, let's get a new lens this afternoon. And finally, so there is a growing vein in scholarly literature at the moment that maintains that we are just not resourced to meet the ethical challenges of the future. So principally, this is like our selfishness and our short-termism in the face of global climate change. And I find this baffling, but there's a significantly growing number of people that say the right response to this is moral bioenhancement. Like what we need to do is genetically engineer like the human animal to be morally better, which I find naively optimistic in terms of what near science is going to look like. It looks naively optimistic about our wisdom in using science, and it's really quite pessimistic about what else might be out there. So maybe before we go tinkering with the moral hardware, we could look to see if actually there are already existent moral softwares that can do the job quite well. Right. So what are African approaches to bioethics? Since I'm speaking at the end of an Ibogaine panel, I'm going to dispense with the introductory slide on what is Iboga, who are the Bwiti, where is Gabon, and give you a quick run through of African ethics before getting a bit more content heavy. First and foremost, if you have any questions about African bioethics, your question might be, why is this white European guy getting up on stage and talking about African ethics as if there is such a thing as African ethics? Right, so I have reflected on my positionality a lot as I've come through this talk, like come through the writing of this talk. I've been worried, like, what if in my naivete, I'm sort of replicating epistemically colonial practices and just like searching for spices or something like that. I only have 30 minutes, so I won't say lots about that. You're welcome to ask me in the Q&A. But for now, I will give you the important bit on that. Which is that I am not seeking to homogenize the incredible cultural and intellectual diversity of Africa. I am following the field, focusing on the salient features in African ethics that recur across the continent. I'm not seeking to essentialize or be normatively prescriptive, i.e. the ethical concepts I'm going to lay down here. I'm not saying they're unique to Africa, are found invariably across Africa. Nor do I mean to suggest that any person of an African nationality or descent does hold these views or that they should hold these views. If I need to make that any clearer, when I talk about, say, Western ethics, I'm not suggesting it's found throughout the West or that every Western person thinks this way. Okay. So in the last 30 years or so, there have been efforts to do this sampling of African worldviews, and more recently, this has culminated in a series of attempts to turn them into a systematic framework. You'll see some of these below. And of those, the features that really ring out as important in African bioethical context is they're highly relational. Like what seems to matter is what's going on in relationships between two people or within groups. They're highly contextual. You need to know a lot of background information before judging the value of a behavior or an action. And where possible, if you see rival or what a Western mind might think of rival values going on, consider them as complementary rather than in conflict. Right, so the most distinctive of these, as I've thought about it, is this relationality, this foundational relationality, by which what's in focus in the moral framework isn't the individual, as in Western individualist approaches. It's not the individual as, say, a bearer of rights or as a sentient being that can experience pleasure or pain. Rather, it's about the relationships between people and what their quality is. And this has really been drawn out by a framework by Thaddeus Metz at Pretoria, and I'll be focusing on that going forward. Right, so the ideal relationality, according to this ethic, is sometimes glossed as fellowship or communality, harmony, cohesion, or friendliness. And beyond this slide, I am only going to give you stuff that I think we really do need to talk about psychedelics. But before I do that, I'll just sprinkle in a few interesting things that I couldn't leave out. The first being that one recurring feature with regards to this relationality and fellowship, what's important is not just cultivating harmony with the group of people that you're in or your family. It also extends to ancestors or other unseen beings. And secondly, when it's not a relational ethic, when it's an individualist ethic, like in Amara Chimakonam's version, it is a distinctly relational kind of individualist ethic. So this is a sort of ethic of self-perfection, like what the right thing to do is to make yourself like the best exemplar of humanity that you can. But in these African frameworks, the best exemplar of humanity is not like Plato putting the right parts of your soul in the right order, or Aristotle prioritizing that part of your soul that can contemplate the divine. It is like the most valuable feature of your human nature is your relational capacities, your ability to live communally with others, to cultivate interpersonal harmony, to exhibit friendliness towards others. Okay, so what the hell are these communal, harmonial, friendly relationships? So Thadmet has a very clear exposition that I have just taken and put up there for you to look at what I talk. He glosses this very often as friendliness. And I like this a lot because what captures a very good communal relationship is a lot like a good friendship. And what do we tell little kids friendship is about? We say it is about sharing and caring, or to put it a little less glibly, it's about sharing a way of life, a sense of identity, and solidarity, caring about another person's way of life. To flesh this out a little more, both sharing and caring, identity and solidarity, have distinct cognitive, affective, action, and motivational components. So if we take first care, like the cognitive component features something a bit like the cognitive version of empathy, like you're interested in what another person is about. If there are any psychologists in the room, this is probably a bit more like Peter Fonagy's mentalizing construct, like with the level of detail you put to trying to work out what makes someone tick, what are they about, even going so far as to understand stuff that they don't even recognize about themselves. Motivationally, there's something like, the mudita of Buddhism, sympathetic joy, but also sympathetic sorrow. John Mbiti says of the virtuous man in this ethic, when he is sorrow, he does not sorrow alone, but with the corporate group. When he feels joy not alone, but with kinsmen and community. Right, and so in terms of what action you do when you care about someone, you act to improve their lot, like act to improve their life in some way, where this doesn't just mean increase their welfare, it means improve them. If you don't ever call out the bad behavior of your friends, like you are not being a good friend. That's what this is kind of gesturing at. And finally, in terms of motivation for this caring, it's altruistic. You do these things, you try and improve someone else's lot because you care about them. Moving over to sharing, it's not just sharing your toys, although that is one feature of this. So cognitively, it's about sharing a way of life. Being in a communal relationship with someone is about considering yourself as part of a we rather than an I. It's like the opposite of othering. Emotionally, when you are sharing a way of life with someone or with a group, you feel joy to be in the presence of them. You value the sense of belonging that you have with them. In terms of action, you act jointly with the people that you're in a communal relationship with. What that doesn't necessarily mean you're always pursuing cooperative projects together, although it can do. It means when you're planning how you're going to pursue your goals, you talk about it with your friends and make sure maybe you plan stuff so that you can reach your goals together, or at least you're not doing anything that obstructs your friend from pursuing their goals. And once again, in terms of motivation, this is altruistic. You're not cooperating with the people that you care about because you know that's how you'll get what you want. Like you genuinely care about them pursuing their goals just like yours. So to return to a point I made earlier about one way to test the mettle of a moral theory is by seeing if it can account for our moral intuitions. I think this framework does pretty well. So acts of deception, ultimately they stem from a divisive attitude. If you're lying to someone, you're not really setting yourselves up as a we. You're obstructing that other person's ability to truly share in a way of life with you. The reason why seducing someone's spouse is problematic, according to this framework, is because it's not valuing the most important thing that we have, which is these communal relationships. acts of sexual abuse are extreme subordination. So there is no care element motivating that. And potentially, given the common psychological fallout that can result, you are denigrating someone's capacity to form these communal relationships going forward. All right, so you have all been very patient while I've been quite expositional there. And I'm conscious that this is a psychedelic conference and not an ethics conference. So now I will turn to what adopting an ethical framework like this, one that values friendliness, one that values communal relationship, might mean for conducting Ibogaine research. So first out of the gate, I think it's important to emphasize that adopting a new framework like this doesn't mean that we have to turn everything upside down and start all over again. So stuff that we value, that we think is central and important to the research process, we can still get with this framework. So free and informed consent, for example, is still robustly grounded here. If you think about the failures of free and informed consent, they happen because either a patient is unclear about the basic terms of the interaction, or they've given consent because of some deception, or they're consenting because of the imposition of some uneven power dynamic that's being exploited. So in the Western mode of thinking, all of these are unacceptable because they're violations of autonomy. And according to the relational ethic, these are problematic because they're fundamentally unfriendly in nature. As with the deception example I just gave, you're not truly sharing in a way of life. You're not truly cooperating with someone if they don't actually know what they've got themselves into, if they're deceived, or if they're being subordinated. So those acts of subordination are acts of othering. So as well as keeping the stuff that we treasure, one of the reasons I'm interested in this is because potentially it promotes or emphasizes the need for some new stuff. Most timely, I'm thinking about the provision of post-trial care. So it's safe to say we're in something of a transitional period in the field where we're all kind of coming down off the high of the last few years and recognizing that while these medicines are good and they will help a lot of people, they are far from flawless and they do not go phenomenally well for everyone. I know, actually, I can see some people in the crowd who did not ever get high on this and always kept their feet on the ground, and gold stars to those people. So one thing that is being increasingly acknowledged kind of in the discourse and has been replicated in my own PhD research interviews is the fact that people can come into real challenges of making sense of their lives in the months and years that follow one of these trials. And so when I suggest, as I have suggested at ICPR last year, if there are any ethics groupers in the room, I know this is expensive, but we need to really expand what the integration protocols say, just so there are things that are available, because I have had enough conversations with underground therapists who have had to scoop up the pieces of people that have been broken by commercial trials. Okay, so I've got my own personal interest in post-trial care, but luckily enough, I think this ethic of communality grounds that responsibility quite well. And it does that because despite, Hattie's got the one on 10 minutes, that's fine. So despite the reams and reams of paperwork that you have to go through, running a psychedelic trial is not a business exercise. So this ethic of communality gives cause for any researcher running any trial to consider themselves as engaged in a cooperative project with their participants. But I think in a psychedelic trial, the relationships that formed are exemplar communal relationships. So you onboard your participant, you have 2-3 preparation sessions with them in which you are making a point to generate rapport. like you are aiming to generate rapport for the purposes of the trial, then you shepherd these people through one of the most profound experiences of their lives, where you ask a particular amount of emotional vulnerability for them, and then you spend 2 or 3 sessions sort of smoothing things out and kind of stitching them back up, perhaps. What that is a communal relationship. And the thing about communal relationships is that they can be morally entangling in important ways. They give rise to unassumed duties, even if you don't make an explicit agreement to them. So you have duties to your friends just because they're your friends. Like, you might have a moral duty, maybe a defeasible moral duty, but a moral duty to help your friends move house when they ask, right? And even though, like, a stranger who's moving house at the same time, they are worthy of moral consideration because they're a human with these relational capacities, etc. There's something about you owing more to your friends because of that friendship. And I don't think that's exhausted by like a quid pro quo or, well, you helped me move last time. Yeah, I think these relationships grounds particular duties, and in the same way you can have duties to your friends, you can have duties to people that you come into contact with in other scenarios. These duties don't have to be absolute or totalizing, so the nature and strength of them can vary according to the relationship. So perhaps you owe more to your immediate family than you do to your extended family. You owe more to your friends than your colleagues. But so say you work in a pub and you're just finishing a shift, and one of your colleagues comes in into the building to relieve your shift. You're ready, you're excited to go. And just as they start talking to you, they get a call through and their car has been totaled, right? They're obviously in distress and they've got something big to handle, right? According to a rights-based framework, that has fuck all to do with you, right? But I think in this scenario, you don't have an obligation or any weight of duty for your friend to help your friend get a new car. But I think to some extent, you have a duty to maybe delay leaving for half an hour so that she can make some calls. And I think that's because you've been in a communal relationship. This is the contextuality that I spoke about a few slides ago. And I think this contextuality also feeds into the trial scenario. Like, I don't think researchers, even if they formed a communal relationship with their participants, are on the hook for everything. Say 2 weeks after a trial concludes, one of the participants is in a bit of a bind and needs childcare. Like, I don't think researchers need that. But if 2-3 weeks after a trial, they're really struggling with the material that arose for them, in that Ibogaine trial, which is sort of the conceptual site of the relationship in play, maybe there is something of a duty there. But on the other hand, suppose you are running a retrospective or a prospective trial just over the internet. You are engaged in something of a cooperative project with these people, but it's much weaker, and it's because of its lower strength, presumably has lower strength of duties, because, well, you never meet, you don't really get to form and bond in the same way. So in those scenarios, there's probably not a good claim on post-trial access or care, but maybe you should think about making sure participants have resources so they know where to go, whether it's signposting resources or developing new ones if they're not available, or perhaps putting aside some money to support advocacy or support within the mainstream healthcare. All that said, so I think what I've said so far is quite attractive, but you would be right to be suspicious if I said that shifting a moral framework would be completely challenge-free or not require revision of anything else that we find important. So something that comes up a lot in biomedical research in Africa is that there's a distinct norm of confidentiality, which in the West, like informed consent, is treated as near sacrosanct. We don't just respect participants' autonomy with regards to what happens to their body, but also what happens with sensitive information that they have. So recall that the ethic of communality demands that we recognize and honor extant communal relationships. It's why we don't seduce someone out of a marriage. valuing that requires recognizing duties that come out of these relationships. So trial participants likely come to a trial in these communal relationships with their family members. Hopefully, they're operating as a we, but their family members plausibly have a legitimate stake in their health and well-being, and arguably should know about the risks and major decisions about it. So frequently, but not always, participants will come to a trial with and be collected by their partners. But conceivably, someone doesn't want their partner to know that they're participating in an Ibogaine trial. And because of this importance of honoring pre-existing communal relationships, I think there's an issue here with maintaining confidentiality. It might not be that researchers have to tell spouses, for example. It might just be that they're not doing anything wrong by sharing that information. I have 3 thoughts on this. The first is that we can just sidestep this issue by insisting at the outset that partners know about trial participation and are part of the process. Second, you could probably get buy-in from this from a welfarist perspective quite easily, because people struggle when they can't talk about these psychedelic experiences with their spouses. And finally, confidentiality is already a limited duty. We already have times when we break confidentiality, as when a participant makes a credible threat of harm. So this would less be about weakening confidentiality, but more about redrawing the boundaries of where transitions are acceptable. More briefly, so the model adds weighting to the excellent stuff that is out there, but is not quite routine. So one thing that slots really well into this framework is encouraging PPI, patient and public involvement in research, and also co-production. I've thrown up some definitions from the NIHR on the right, and don't think I need to do huge amounts of legwork to join the dots between those definitions and the ethic that I've been talking about today. So the stated aims of these initiatives are to really hear and understand the perspectives of people that might otherwise be working at considerable psychological distance with you. They are invitations to come together as a we. Yes, and so I'm conscious that PPI and co-production tends to be underreported, and it might already be going on loads in the psychedelic field. But if that's not the case, then Imperial are way ahead of the game, and I throw up 2 papers that you can pursue if you're interested in that. This one by James Close and Meg Spriggs is particularly good for guiding people how to do it. Oh, 1 minute, okay. And finally, I think there are some links to what Kieran was talking about problems with indigenous washing. And responding to indigenous washing with respect, representation, and reciprocity rebates. So the ethic of communality endorses seeking communal rather than transactional relationships with indigenous communities. And there is something about just handing over a big payout that's like throwing money at a problem to get rid of it, not coming to understand and care about people that you engage with. Moreover, if you think there's any value in the broad brush project I've laid out here, i.e. seeking alignment or complementarity of worldviews as part of respectful engagement, there's a lot more to be done. So it won't have escaped your notice that I've been talking about African ethics, but not even mentioned Bwiti ethics specifically. So what I've found on Bwiti ethics is consistent with what I've laid out here, but there's much more to do, and I'm not the person to be doing that. This is plausibly a role for the intercultural intermediaries or indigenous elders that Kieran was talking about, to kind of enrich the bare bones of what I've laid out here. And I do not have enough time to read through those summary points, so I'll leave them out on the slide. Oh, well, I'm just going to read out that slide, so I don't think it matters. Looking at things differently has both practical and theoretical relevance. So African ethics, just like psychedelic trials, are relational. And my contention is that relationships can ground duties. Adopting a relational frame doesn't mean we have to start again from nothing. We can save lots of stuff we want. Conceiving of psychedelic trials as communal cooperative enterprises can bring to the forefront new duties, because signed bits of paper and formal agreements can define legal obligations but they don't exhaust moral obligations. Post-trial care may be required even where it's not promised. This ethical lens also brings into sharper focus other features of good research practice, like PPI and co-production, which are, by their very ethos, exemplar communal undertakings. And according to an ethic that values this communality, these are things we should be seeking out. And finally, if there's any merit to anything I've said at all in the last half hour, we might see it as part of a larger project about how best to engage with indigenous communities who have served as stewards of these medicines and their wisdom. Thank you.